Good evening. On behalf of De Nieuwe Liefde, I welcome you all. This is an English-spoken program, you know all that. Especially warm welcome to Katharina von Kellenbach. I hope you will feel at home in this house. It is a very fascinating and important topic which brings us together this evening. A program around guilt and repentance, forgiveness, truth and reconciliation. All key words in the Bible, in Jewish and Christian traditions, but how can they apply to perpetrators of horrible atrocities? This question will accompany us in the next hour and a half. Manuela Kalski will preside this meeting. I kindly invite you to introduce Katharina to us, her audience.
Thank you, Alex, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And a very, very special welcome, of course, to Katharina von Kellenbach. At this moment, is the researcher in residence at the theological faculty of the VU University, and tonight she is here with us in the Nieuwe Liefde. She will stay one more week here in the Netherlands, and then she goes back to the United States, where she is a professor of religious studies at St. Mary's College in Maryland. She is born and bred in West Germany. She studied theology in Berlin and Göttingen. She became active in Jewish-Christian dialogue and in Holocaust studies while studying, I think, at Temple University in Philadelphia, isn't it? And completed her dissertation on anti-Judaism in feminist religious writings. That was in 1994, already a long time ago. I can remember that very well. We are also colleagues in the study of feminist theology, so we know each other from that time. Her areas of expertise includes feminist theology and Jewish-Christian relations, life and work of the first female Rabbi Regina Jonas of Berlin, who was murdered in Auschwitz. Her recent book, The Mark of Cain, this book, and the denial in the lives of Nazi perpetrators, published in 2013, is based on the historical records of prison chaplains' pastoral work with Nazi perpetrators in post-war Germany and examines the political implications of the Christian theological emphasis on forgiveness. This research was supported by the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. I think it's a very important research, and also the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, and allowed her to explore the social, spiritual, moral, and intellectual reality of Nazi perpetrators among whom she has grown up without knowing it. And I think we will hear more about that in a few minutes. The title of her lecture is A Liberation Theology for Perpetrators, reading the parable of the son. Yes, prodigal son with Nazi convicts. Katharina, the floor is yours.
I want to start by thanking Manuela for bringing me to Amsterdam and for the Nieuwe Liefde for organizing this evening. And since we're a small group, I'm perfectly happy also to be interrupted if there are questions. Otherwise, I will lead you through this, really through the book, which I think actually you should, since we are a small group, you may as well just leaf through it, which has really accompanied me for the last 14 years. I started this research in 2000, and in fact, it's really longer than that. I was asked to prepare a talk, an essay, really to write an essay for next year, 2015, when it is 70 years of liberation, the liberation of the camps. And like any good scholar, I Googled the term, put it into the search engine, and when you put in liberation, there are really two terms that come up. One is, of course, the liberation of the camps and the website of the Holocaust Museum, and the other one is liberation theology. And so I thought that is sort of interesting that those are the most searched topics when you put in liberation into the Google search machine. So I want to ask my question was, is there such a thing as a liberation theology for perpetrators? And as a feminist theologian, I've of course always been puzzled by the fact that feminist theology is done from the perspective of women, black theology is done from the perspective of blacks, liberation theology is done from the perspective of the poor. But there is really no response in either one of those movements. And so I took it upon myself to write a liberation theology from the perspective of perpetrators, i.e., I wanted to know what liberation might mean from the perspective of the perpetrators. And as you will be the judges of whether that is an oxymoron, an impossibility from the get-go, or whether it makes sense to ask the question of what liberation might mean from the perspective of perpetrators. Liberation, of course, meant for perpetrators imprisonment. So immediately after the Allies defeated Nazi Germany and liberated the camps and liberated the victims of Nazi Germany, the officials of the Nazi Party were interned on the basis of the law of automatic arrest. So there were hundreds of thousands of Germans who were in internment camps, and those who were the guards and the officials in the camps were imprisoned. And you can see by the numbers that just killing programs of Nazi Germany, the estimates range between 100,000 and 500,000 men and women. 5,000 of the killers were women, so it's about 9% of perpetrators are women. 99% are men, which I think, there's sort of feminist implications to those numbers as well. But so liberation, in fact, meant imprisonment and prosecution for Nazi perpetrators. It is also clear when you look at these numbers that the criminal justice system can never completely deal with guilt in the aftermath of atrocities, because the numbers, in fact, exceed what a criminal justice system can do. And we've seen this after Rwanda. We've really seen this in any number of cases since, that people who become guilty of murder in political crimes, in atrocities, cannot be processed, so to speak, in any way. The term justice can really, there is no justice in the aftermath of such crimes. The Christian churches took it upon themselves to make it their highest priority to send ministers into these internment camps and to the prisons, and to work with Nazi perpetrators, many of whom had in fact left the Roman Catholic and the Protestant Church in order to embrace a Nazi religion called Gottgläubig. They felt after 1937 that the Christian church was way too Jewish. It had, this Old Testament. It was a Jewish God. It preached a gospel of weakness and solidarity with the oppressed, and an ethic that did not, in fact, show strength and power and might. And so they left the churches, not at all. Adolf Hitler, for instance, never left the Roman Catholic Church. There were several high-ranking Nazis who remained both in the Roman Catholic and the Protestant Church, but a good percentage of them left. And of course, some of the ministers who afterwards went into the camps to work with those Nazi perpetrators were themselves victims. Martin Niemöller was a prisoner since 1938. He spent 8 years in camps. And he immediately began to make the rounds from internment camp to internment camps, from prison to prison, to preach a gospel of forgiveness as well as guilt. He is, of course, best known for his poetic retelling of the sermon. When they came for the communists, I was silent. When they came for the Union State, I was silent. And so he accuses himself and tries to model a Christian understanding of responsibility in light of this gospel of forgiveness. I want to give you one other sort of snapshot of the other side of the gospel that was brought to internment camps, that in fact talks about or uses the term liberation and uses the term freedom. So that is really my starting point, looking at this particular minister who was in fact interned himself. So in some internment camps, it was not an outside minister who was sent in, but they were in fact themselves interned for any number of reasons. This particular minister had been trained by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and then he had joined the Abwehr, and as also several of them did. In any case, he ended up in American imprisonment and began to create a congregation amongst these high-ranking Nazis, SS men of various ranks who were sitting in American military camps. And so when he says, in our Protestant Moosburg camp congregation, the liberation from guilt and desolation has brought us into the magnificent freedom of the children of God. The divine act of liberation fused us into a congregation which will persist outside the barbed wire. For this we want to thank the Lord. So I want to begin with this question of what liberation is and how one speaks of liberation in prison. Because we have to begin with a very different understanding of what freedom means. And the Christian message of liberation, in fact, is based upon a paradox that there is a dialectic tension between external freedom and internal freedom. That is to say, one can be free externally, but be internally enslaved by an ideology, for instance, which prevents one from acting freely, from choosing right and wrong. And one can be externally imprisoned in a prison and become internally free and regain a sense of responsibility. And so that is the way in which this term liberation is used in this particular passage. And so I want to begin with this notion that perpetrators may have been possessed by an ideology, and certainly in terms of how they spoke of their service to the state. When you think about Adolf Eichmann, for instance, later on, he talked of himself as merely being a tool in the hands of superiors, of following orders, of not, in fact, choosing freely. And so one of the indications of how perpetrators speak is that they abdicate agency. They do not say, I chose to do this, I chose to kill, but they always talk as if they have no choice in the matter. And so in that sense, one can speak of them being enslaved, and in that sense, these prison chaplains were trying to speak to them about liberation, what it is to overcome Nazi ideology to which they had dedicated their lives passionately and which they had followed, and convert into freedom. To quote Martin Luther, right, he talks of the freedom of the Christian and what it means to become, in fact, free. So I think that in terms of the systematic theology, that is what the Christian message of forgiveness or the Christian message of liberation at its best, in theory, meant. Now we will look at how it was corrupted in the actual life of perpetrators. Because, of course, as I'm doing this research, I come at this from a theological point of view, knowing what the Christian message of justification, redemption means to say. But I'm also using empirical evidence. In other words, I'm looking at how perpetrators who were converted, who bought into this message, who followed Christ, whether it actually did the trick, right? Did it in fact liberate them? Were they able to overcome their dependence on this ideology, or was the message to some extent corrupted or cheapened, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer called this cheap grace? So I want to give you 4 examples to test this. 2 each, it's one Roman Catholic convert, one Protestant convert in the immediate post-war period, and then a Roman Catholic convert and a Protestant convert during the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And we can see whether or not this theory of conversion and this message of liberation was actually possible, and if not, how one needs to in order to get to this. So the first convert is Oswald Poole, who was in charge of the economic empire of the SS, which means he ran the entire concentration camp system. He was responsible really for 11 million people who died, perished in the camps. He designed the annihilation by labor. He came up with the notion of having brothels in concentration camps. He used the gold teeth, the hair, any atrocity you have ever come across went over his desk. He had grown up Protestant and then converted to Roman Catholicism, and he wrote a conversion memoir called Credo, My Path to God, which was published in 1950. And it's a fascinating book. And I just want to show you one image that was actually painted by his wife, which captures the way in which this message of liberation and message of forgiveness functioned in the lives of Nazi perpetrators. First the text and then the image. I have made a resolute and clean break with my previous life. Whatever was good in it, I have taken as uplifting memories into my reborn life. Whatever was bad, that which caused the minus balance, my innumerable sins, I carried humbly before God in prayer and fasting. That he took it from me, I feel as his immeasurable grace in my life. So what you see here is a notion of liberation that somehow takes away all the guilt. It is now taken from him. Whatever he has done previously is gone. And the image, I think, really captures this, this understanding. And that, of course, also then gets enacted in German political life, which talks about the Schlussstrich, the line of closure, or the hour zero, where everybody is sort of reborn, starts over, there's a new beginning, and whatever happened before disappears, is taken away, is somehow in the past, and we now no longer have to look at this past. And so he leaves the violence and Enlightenment thinking and National Socialism behind him, and this little figure is sort of going off into the sunset and starts over. And of course, there's a lot within Christian theology that encourages or at least condones this way of thinking. You know, we talk about being born again. We talk about the new Adam. We talk about this renewal that somehow is based upon leaving what has been destroyed behind. So I'll come back to this because I think that is a critical problem with the notion of forgiveness and to some extent with the notion of liberation, that you somehow get to reinvent yourself and 11 million dead are gone and you don't have to remember them either. I should also say that in his conversion narrative, Oswald Poole speaks of guilt only in quotation marks, which should be, you know, a sign that something is not quite right. And then here are his last words. The prison chaplains prepared those who were executed for their last words, and they were also recorded in German and in English, and they're part of the archive in Washington, D.C. Long live Germany. For more than 30 years, I've served as a professional soldier. That's the first lie, right? He was not a soldier. 22 years of which were with the Marines. During this long period, the Americans were not able to prove or lay at my feet that I had given any orders or initiated any instructions which led to the persecution or execution of people, especially Jews. I die firm in the belief in God in three persons. God have mercy on my family, my faithful wife, and free Germany from its bad friends. Those were his last words. They are not the truth on several levels, and one can certainly not detect any sign of contrition. So even though he may have practiced a pious, a certain kind of piety, one can certainly not speak of a forgiveness or liberation from the ideology that he had submitted himself to. I want to talk a little bit about the Roman Catholic versus the Protestant approach to justification. If you remember anything about Reformation history, it was, of course, over that point that the Roman Catholic and the Protestant churches split. Indulgences, right? Whether or not one has to perform works. So in the Roman Catholic understanding, there are 3 steps required before the sacrament of penance or reconciliation can be performed. One is one has to feel heartfelt contrition. Second of all, one has to speak truthfully, confess. And third, there have to be some acts of satisfaction in this process. This is a medieval concept which is also to some extent in the Jewish tradition. Maimonides has a similar process, and I think actually that makes a lot of sense. You can also see that that is to some extent the frame upon which truth and reconciliation commissions in South Africa, for instance, are built. Right? A perpetrator who is contrite, who confesses, and who is willing to do something in some kind of reparation, is then given reconciliation and amnesty. So that is a political forgiveness and reconciliation that I think is relevant again in the contemporary period. Martin Luther was very critical over this system because he argued that one can never be sure whether somebody is contrite. And of course he was right, that it is very hard to prove the truthfulness of your contrition. And so he therefore argued that grace has to come before works. In other words, that a perpetrator is so caught in blindness and in the ideological prison in which they are in, that they cannot, out of their own effort, liberate themselves. In other words, they have to be liberated by God. And so he reversed this and talked about sin as a form of blindness and forgiveness as a grace which is given unconditionally. And one of the verses that are usually then quoted by Protestant theologians is when Jesus hangs on the cross. He says to the Roman soldiers who are performing the execution, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. Okay, so this is really the reversal. In other words, their contrition comes after forgiveness because they do not know what they're doing. It has its own truth to it because we know for a fact that they did not know what they were doing, and so what can actually touch their hearts so that they come to some kind of recognition of culpable wrongdoing. In the Protestant liturgy then, although this has actually changed, there's a liturgy from around the turn of the century where the notion of repentance is still in. This is a new liturgy that was written specifically for the prison chaplaincy with perpetrators in internment camp, and they completely erased any notion of repentance. I give you the previous one and then this one. The omnipotent God has taken pity upon you and truly forgives, and previously it says for all your sins that you are contrite for, that's cut out, right? There's no repentance, forgives all sins because of his beloved Son. And I, as the installed servant of the church, pronounce such forgiveness of all of your sins to you on the order of our Lord Jesus Christ. The language is also just really 47. So here there is absolutely no condition of recognition of culpable wrongdoing. There is a message of forgiveness really on the cheap. So let me give you the example of a Protestant convert who converted in WCP number 1. That's War Crimes Prison number 1, Landsberg-Lech. And he was the deputy commander of the concentration camp in Buchenwald. He was responsible for all penal actions, that is to say, for all beatings, for all executions in this camp. And he became very active in the prison church. He joined the choir, he participated in all the services. And the prison chaplain then, I give you first his last words. Again, all of those are collected in Washington, D.C., and then I tell you what the prison minister wrote about him. Colonel, I want to use this moment to emphatically protest the conviction that led to this death sentence. Before the face of God, before whom I will stand in the next moment, I affirm that I'm innocent of the crimes with which I have been charged. I declare that I have done nothing else than what you, sirs, are doing right now. I have executed orders that had been legally given to me. I die as the last of the Landsberger death candidates. I die innocent. It is remarkable, I have to say, that the faces of the US soldiers are scratched out in this particular image. Not in the earlier one, but this set was the last execution in June of 1951. And his words, of course, there's some truth to this, right? Because they're also executing somebody on orders. And he claims, of course, that he had done nothing else, and therefore he's innocent. The prison chaplain writes to the minister who's then doing the funeral, and writes, you may be surprised that his last words don't show any contrition. However, I can assure you that he repented his sins, which in fact for those prison chaplains meant mostly personal sins, but that in terms of his work in Buchenwald, he was, quote, not aware of any cruelty. Ist sich keiner Grausamkeit bewusst, is the German term. And that is a term that really strikes one's heart, because Buchenwald was such a place of cruelty that for him to walk through there every day and not to be bewusst, right, of any cruelty to the very end, right, and have the prison chaplain to some extent collude in that illusion, right, is quite remarkable, and is in fact the very problem that I was facing with in terms of that message of liberation. How can there be liberation if one is facing complete denial of culpable wrongdoing? So this is why the parable of the prodigal son does not work in the context of Nazi perpetrators. The parable of the prodigal son is, of course, the son who demands his inheritance by his father, then goes off and squanders his inheritance, drops to the bottom of the heap, is an impoverished beggar and swineherd, and lives in misery, and then repents of his choices and returns to his father. And the father welcomes him back into the house unconditionally and without sort of pointing out his wrongdoing. So it's a very powerful story of forgiveness, which in the context of Nazi perpetrators does not work, because Nazi perpetrators did not leave the house of the father. They are not criminals who broke the law. They acted on behalf of the state. So there were 3 instances in this sample of the execution boxes. There are 8 execution boxes in Washington, D.C. with last words. And I went through all 8 boxes to look for one statement, one last word that would give me a hint of contrition. There were 3. And one of them was also mentioned in the diary of the prison chaplain, who writes that he broke down in tears during confession and that he required psychological treatment. He was suicidal, and he was just overcome by the severity of his crime. So I became very intrigued by this man until I found out that he was executed, and he was in war crimes prison number 1, Landsberg-Lech, but he was there because he had killed a US soldier over a black market deal for 300 cans of chocolate sauce. They had struggled over the price, or something went down, and they fought, and he killed the soldier, which was considered a war crime, and he received the death penalty for it. And he's the only one who breaks down in tears and who, in his last words, acknowledges guilt. So the son who leaves the house because he breaks a law individually feels repentance and then returns. The son who acts on behalf of the father does not feel contrition, does not repent, and cannot return to the father. So that the model with which the prison chaplains worked did in fact not work in this particular case, because these were not criminals. They did not see themselves as criminals. They were also, of course, educated. They were lawyers, they were doctors, they were philosophers, they had graduate degrees, and they acted in the interest of the state. And for them, the way in which they talk about the parable of the prodigal son, there's one that I wrote an article about recently. He says this no longer my father's house because the master of the house has changed. So they did not move, the house changed. And they feel all of a sudden expelled. But that's a very different emotional experience that they're in fact going through. So I want to move into the 60s. In the 60s, of course, there's a second set of trials in West Germany. And now it is not the victors who are trying Nazi perpetrators, but now it is in fact the West German justice system that is grappling with West German perpetrators. And I want to give you two examples of men who were involved in mass murder. And they both, in fact, became clergymen. One became a Roman Catholic priest, and the other one became a Protestant minister. And they had very different pathways, which I think are quite important to understand how this works. One was Matthias Defregger, who was involved in a reprisal killing of Italian villagers in Italy, and he was exposed shortly after he was ordained as a bishop by the Spiegel, and the courts reopened a trial. And I really just want to very shortly point out that one of the things that happens is that the churches really put a lot of pressure on the victims to issue statements of forgiveness. And so in this particular case, he then issued a statement in the press, which he titled Solidarity with the Victims. But he failed to send this letter to this village in Italy, where he had killed 17 villagers. But meanwhile, in the village, there was great pressure put on the villagers, the survivors, the widows, to in fact issue statements of forgiveness. And what you see then is a mismatch. So that, he says, I feel myself legally and above not guilty. And the victims offer forgiveness, which he is not willing to accept. You cannot accept an expression of forgiveness if you, in fact, do not feel guilty. And that is the case. I mean, he's just one example. I could issue many of them who say, I don't need to be forgiven because I have not done anything wrong. So therefore, it is beside the point. So this return into the Father's house also does not work in terms of the relationships between perpetrators and victims. It does not work between perpetrator and God, but it's also problematic in the relationship between perpetrators and their victims. I should also say that in the Christian tradition, of course, there's no moment at which the perpetrator is asked to go to the victim and ask for forgiveness. That is quite different from the Jewish tradition, where between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, there are 10 days where every Jew is required to go to their brother and sister and ask for forgiveness before you go and ask God on Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement. There's still this notion in the Gospel, in Matthew 5:24, it says, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled with your brother, and then come and offer your gift at the altar. But in the Christian tradition, there is at no point of that process of forgiveness is there the mandate to go and face the victims. And so Defregger, although he was an ordained man, in fact did not try to go to Italy, did not make himself sort of a symbol of Christian forgiveness. Which I think would have been very powerful precisely because he was a man who stood in the public limelight. I think it was a missed opportunity to actually show a different way to deal with guilt. Instead, he went completely into denial. He was then removed from the public eye. And when he died in 1995, his funeral was officiated by then Cardinal Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict. And none of the eulogies mention either the massacre or 1969, right? So in other words, his recovery, his moral repair is in fact based upon forgetting. And so forgiving is linked to forgetting. And I think that is a very problematic way, irrespective of what it does to the victims. I think that's very clearly the wrong message for victims, but I think it's the wrong pathway for perpetrators to, in fact, regain their moral dignity on the basis of erasing the past. Because these moments were traumatic moments for Defregger, right? Both the original killing in 1945, as well as 1969, when he was exposed and had to go through this media. Those are very, very important moments in his life. And to have his funeral and all of the eulogies not mention this. I mean, you can Google him yourself. You will find that his life is celebrated without mention to either one of these cases. The other minister worked very differently, and I want to begin with the last statement that I found of him of 1983, where he says that no one who was in Majdanek, whether as a guard or as a prisoner, can ever free himself from such an experience. So here you have a notion that freedom is in fact not an erasure of the past, but that genuine liberation requires coming to a different perspective on one's own guilty history. So instead of cutting off and leaving behind the ruins of the past, one actually has to change one's heart towards this. Otto Zarkis was different in several ways, among them that he was born in 1925, which you can see, and he became an SS-man when he was 16, and he was sent first to Buchenwald and then to Majdanek, which was a death camp, where he spent the entire period. And in the documents, he was the only one who spoke of penance. So after the war, he went into the coal mines of Belgium to impose penance on himself, he says. And he was known as Little Jesus because he always took on the hardest and dirtiest jobs. So that was an interesting difference in his life. Then he went on to France and studied theology. And he went to Nice, became a minister in Nice. And there he, in the 50s, went to the police, the French police, and said, I was an SS-man, I served in Majdanek. And the French police was so embarrassed by this that they sent him to a psychiatrist, and they didn't open any proceedings against it. And then when he was called before German prosecutors in the 60s, he begins to tell the story of the first killing that he participated in, where somebody was told to run and then was shot in the back. A Jew was told to run and shot in the back, and then his fellow SS-men carried this man back, and he died, and he looked at him. He looked him in the eye. And that is very, very rare. I found none of the other perpetrators who speak of being gazed at or looking into the eyes of a victim. And at this point, the prosecutor tells him, you have a right to remain silent, you have a right to have an attorney present, everything you say can be used against you. And he says, I don't want an attorney, I want to speak about this, this has haunted me. And then he says, and I want to leave this behind, I want to turn, I have to get rid of this. And so he's still caught in this notion of liberation as moving on, right, moving past this. And it's only during the Majdanek trial, which is in the 80s, that, first of all, he is different because he's the only one who tells the truth during the trial. And the survivors actually mention him by name and say there's one SS-man who's different. He tells the truth, and he has changed his perspective. And it is this particular verse that I think is really the key, where he says you cannot, freedom does not consist of turning away from this. Freedom consists of coming to terms with this past. So I want to use 3 different antidotes to this notion of liberation as a erasure of memory. And that's, of course, how I use the Mark of Cain, because Cain is marked not to be stigmatized so that he can be found and hunted and humiliated, right? Cain is marked as a grace. And so Cain is one of the few role models I found who lives a long life in the face of his guilt. He moves, he marries, he has a child, he builds a city, he becomes the ancestor of artisans and musicians. So it allows us to think of guilt over a lifetime. And I think it is not accidental that Ottozakis was the youngest one and he lived the longest. He lived until 2011. I was still able to talk with him on the telephone and to ask him, how do you deal with this? And why didn't you, I actually asked him, why didn't you as a minister talk about being an SS-man in Majdanek? Why didn't you talk about this as a prison chaplain? He worked as a prison chaplain, right? But he also did not speak openly outside the trial and outside interviews about his past. But at least he gives, he shows that if people live, guilt changes over time. And the more time they have, the greater the chance that eventually something changes. So these stones are actually known as Kainsmal. If you Google Kainsmal, you will find these stones which were erected in the Middle Ages. Perpetrators of a crime were required to pay for a stone that was placed at the place of the murder. So these are not burial stones. They are memorials at the place where a crime occurred. And they're sort of in the middle of the woods, in random places where a killing occurred. There's one, incidentally, on Alexanderplatz. Next time you go to Berlin, you should find it. There's this ancient old stone that serves as a reminder of a killing that occurred in this place. And this is known as Kainsmal. So here you have an interesting model for making the perpetrator responsible for the memorial of the victim as the notion of Kainsmal. So that means that the promise of liberation is in fact not forgetting. Forgiveness is not about forgetting. Forgiveness is about remembering. The second notion I'm struggling with is this notion of burdens, that liberation means that guilt has been lifted from you. Right? We understand liberation as not having to carry a burden. And it seems to me that we ought to talk differently about guilt, namely as the ability to bear burdens. And so I was looking at places where bearing a burden is in fact ennobling. It regains dignity. To bear a burden means you are becoming stronger. And strength and moral strength is being regained by bearing guilt. So, this is from the New Testament. This is, of course, also in the Jewish tradition that one bears the yoke of the Torah, and that there is value and dignity in bearing a burden, right? So instead of thinking of guilt and forgiveness as lifting, I think we should think of forgiveness as the ability to carry the burden and the grace of that strength that it takes to bear that burden. Again, Tsakis is sort of my one example of how that might work. And the last image is liberation from garbage, and to think of traumatic histories as compost piles. So that instead of throwing away the guilt, right? The rubble that is part of guilty histories. That we ought to think of what to do with this. And it is actually what caught my attention was that oftentimes guilt is washed away. It's an act of purification. A person is washed in the blood of the Lamb. We're washed in baptism, and so we wash our hands in innocence. One of the terms of post-Nazi history was Persilschein. So one became clean again by getting rid of the guilt. But any cleaning process leaves some remainder, right? Leaves some kind of every act of purification, of renewal, leaves waste. And what happens to this waste in an ecologically, more sensitive time? This waste does not disappear. It stays in one place, and it in fact needs to be recycled and composted and worked with. And so I like this compost pile because it is in fact a toxic compost pile, and composting is in fact an act of decontamination. And so I think thinking about guilt in the post-war, post-Nazi context is one really ought to think in terms of a process of decontamination of the ideologies that justified the violence. And that requires at least 3 different things, and I think Germany is a good example of that. It requires heat, it requires oxygen, and it requires microbes. Heat is external pressure. There is no transformation of these ideologies if there's not vigilance and external attention. Germany had a lot of external attention to how it dealt with its history. In contrast, for instance, to Austria. Hitler was an Austrian. Many of the perpetrators were Austrian. But Austria was the first victim, and so nobody looked. And their garbage pile stinks in a way that the German pile actually is beginning to show signs of genuine change, right? So heat is one thing. Oxygen, transparency, knowledge, openness, absolutely prerequisite. And microbes, lots of conversations, lots of public education, lots of private conversations, battles that were being done in families. So I'm looking now in my new project, I'm looking at rituals of purification. And I'm really looking at the process of forgiveness really as a process that requires a multitude of stages that are both contradictory and simultaneous and require time. Rituals of repudiation, that's, by the way, you can also see this old model of contrition, confession, and satisfaction behind this model. Criminal prosecution, political purges, removal of elites, public apologies, all of those are forms of renunciation, of repudiating a past. Rituals of lustration. Lustration is a Czech term and means to shed light on a particular crime. Historical truth commissions, disclosure of archival knowledge, documentation centers, commemorations, memorials, Stolpersteine. We've been talking actually with several of you, but there's a lot going on in Germany in particular to actually open up that history, right? That's sort of the oxygen. And rituals of repair, reparations payments, acts of restitution, dialogue, exchange program, cultural productions, art, right? All of those are in fact forms of repair. All of that was required to actually begin to talk about liberation. I want to end with the second generation, and that would really be myself, because I couldn't really find a good example for what I really think ought to be happening in the first generation. One really has to look at the second generation. And so this is really my own history, which of course got me into this project, namely an uncle who was responsible for the killing of 30,000 Jews in Pinsk. A big secret in my family, although he was tried in the 60s and early 70s, but this was not something anybody talked about. And so I had to go through rituals of lustration to actually find out the information of what he had done. He was an SS man who was sent to Belarus as part of the civil administration after the Einsatzgruppen had gone through, so there were big killings of Jewish men. He then came in as part of the civil administration, and he set up the ghetto with about 30,000, mostly women and children, and they were killed over the course of 3 days. 30,000 people on direct orders of Heinrich Himmler at the end of October and the first day of November. And I went to Pinsk with a family of survivors, and they invited me. And we went there, and we had a memorial there. And in that memorial, I first did not want to speak because, I mean, first of all, you can see I'm not especially, it's not a very comfortable place to stand there and talk about your personal relationship with somebody who has such guilt upon them, and to walk in the steps of Cain publicly, right? But I was, in the evening before, one of the family who was a retired judge said, if you think that what your uncle did was wrong, you should say something. And that if cut through my heart, because I thought if that is still a question, then it is important that in that place I engage in a ritual of repudiation, right? That I step out there and I say, I repudiate what my uncle has done, and I ask for forgiveness. I actually use that language, although I think all of this language is wrong. I didn't do it. My uncle did not regret what he had done. The people there could really not issue me statements of forgiveness, and yet that was the language both of repudiation, after a long process of finding out, right, and of facing this. And it was a ritual of repair whereby this history became our history. In this moment, we all took this incredible moment of 30,000 people, Jews of Pinsk, who no longer are. And we mourned this together. We mourned this as the descendants who, the few who survived, and of what is no more, and as the perpetrator, and in this particular case, as the villagers of Belarus who were there as bystanders and, as it turned out, unbeknownst to me, perpetrators, because one of the results I did not anticipate was that after I spoke, they came forward and said that, in fact, the Jewish men had been killed by local thugs in the village. And so we had this conversation about this particular history, and in that moment, I would argue, an act of liberation happened. We were somehow able to have this history not divide us, but have this history join us into a commitment to work towards a different future, a future without racism, without nationalism, without anti-Semitism, that would not divide us again. And so that, I think, is my vision of liberation, and it's my vision of purification, right? It's composting. It's not that this history then is forgotten, but it is that this history is detoxified and no longer acts as a poison between people, but becomes a history that we share and have in common. So with this, I talked for an hour, and I will finally be done. And I invite questions. And I guess Manuela has the first question.
Let us have a seat over there.
On the side? Mm-hmm. Okay.
On the side. This was a quite impressive lecture. Not also to me, I think, but in a way also especially to me, because we share the same background. In a way, both of us are German, born and bred in Germany, and we both know how it feels to go to a country and to be a German. So I was very touched by your kind of ritual, in a way, to go to, I think it was Poland,
Belarus,
and to ask there for forgiveness. Why did you do that, and what did it do to you afterwards?
It was completely the wrong language. And yet it was the only language I could find in the moment. I think what it did was the discussion we had in the middle of this hot village where Germans, Belarusians, and Jews came together and talked about responsibility, but also just loss. And it was a shared mourning for what had been lost. And that felt like a true moment of redemption, where somehow, all of the hauntedness of that history. I mean, it wasn't, it's very dangerous to talk about closure, and as if somehow, it's over. It's not. But there was there was at least a moment of peace that came into view. And so I think that is very important when one deals with these guilty histories, that we also have a vision of goodness coming out, right? I mean, we have to have a feeling that on the other side of coming to terms with this history, there is in fact something better. There is in fact a future that is that can gain from those lessons.
Okay, and what does this vision means to you? What
to
kind
me,
of
I guess
vision is it?
that would be what forgiveness means. Right? So forgiveness is not about wiping away, but it is in fact building upon and learning and taking up, the suffering.
And what is your message? I mean, what does it mean for us today? Because this is not only happening once, of course. This is also happening now in a way. So what can we do, for example, with our young people who has become perhaps perpetrators in Syria, and they are coming back, and everybody is shouting at this moment. A lot of people are shouting we have to prison. We have to. What kind of message is in your story for this very actual thing? What is going on now in our history, also here in the Netherlands, but also in Germany and also in other European countries?
I think it's every part of this is applicable. In other words, I mean, they act out of political ideology. They have handed their lives over to this ideology. I think we have to truly appreciate the strength of these ideological convictions. These Nazis did not just believe this and then the next day they didn't. And I think the same is true for Islamist fighters. It is an act of submission to an ideology, which is very, very deep. And so I think what we need to develop are really 3 steps. We need to have rituals of repudiation, whether or not they're or punishment. I think there needs to be a ritual of repudiation. I think we need to know openly what has been done, the crimes that have been committed, and there needs to be information about what has happened. And I think they ought to be engaged in rituals of reparations, some productive work. And so I think that they also need to know that their human dignity and their moral worth can be repaired. I am very much against declaring people as monsters, right? I think it's very dangerous to say, well, these Nazis, are monsters, and there's no way they can recover as human beings.
They need a second chance?
Not just a second, but a third and a fourth. No human being can be written out of humanity. We cannot allow people, inhuman, and to just or we become like, Islamic State or like the Nazis, who declare people outside the moral community, and therefore, you can kill them. If we do not allow second chances, and if we do not allow people to change and to regain human communities, we are like them. And I find that very troubling.
And if they don't...
A question about... the whole lecture is about things. Your whole lecture... Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes?
Yeah.
The whole lecture is about things. And the last 5 minutes... you were talking about what you were doing, which touched my heart very deeply. And I'm very glad that we're now going to talk about it. I would like to meet you now and not talk about the people in Syria. I want what was going on when you go there as a niece of someone who did that to that place. I would like to know. I would like to come with you to that place, if it's safe enough for you to tell right now.
Yeah, well, I mean, for starters, these rituals of truth-telling are in fact very, very hard. In other words, the longer I was tracing him, I should say that the story, it's a long story, because I was first given a newspaper article when I was about 13, and it was when the trial was discontinued. In other words, he was tried, but he was never convicted, as many Nazi perpetrators in Germany. And so my family was celebrating the fact that all of these charges are lies, okay? And he was, of course, at the table when I'm reading in the newspaper that he was charged with killing 30,000 Jews. And so as a young person, I had 3 questions. One was, who are Jews? I had never met one. How does a person kill 30,000 people? And why is he sitting at the table? How is this possible, right? I mean, does that my parents would not somehow, if he would have killed 1 person, I would not be allowed to be with him. If he would have killed 10 people, he would be a serial murderer. But the fact that he killed 30,000 meant nothing. And so I was completely confused, and when I began to ask questions, I was completely shut down. You shouldn't be asking this, because I think just in asking, I was communicating that I didn't quite join in the family celebration, right? I wasn't quite willing to accept the denial that sort of covered everything. And so I was immediately shut down, and eventually I forgot it because I couldn't make sense of it. And then I remembered when I was in a Yom HaShoah observance in Philadelphia, and we were asked to go into pairs and to talk about when we first heard about the Holocaust. And in that moment, I remembered that I didn't hear about the Holocaust in school, but in fact, that newspaper article was when I was first exposed to the Holocaust. And so then I went back to my family. In fact, I went to the other uncle who had given me the newspaper article, and I asked him, "Why did you show this to me?" And he then sent my letter to my father, and my father called me, and he said, "Don't ask this. There's nothing to know. These are all lies. None of this is true." And I didn't get anywhere. And so it took another couple of years until I was at the university, until I had university stationery that I could go to the archive with a trumped-up research proposal to gain access to the indictment.
So you have to split up yourself. You have to split from your family.
Yes.
Right.
I had to
and
split.
You said in the article that I read, to commit a crime, you have to divorce yourself from kind of feelings. So when you are searching for truth, you have to divorce family. How do you call? How did you do that?
You have to. You go over to the other side. In other words, I realized that in order to be in relationship with my Jewish peers in America, who all knew exactly where their families were, and when they asked me, "Where was your family?" I knew nothing. And I realized that my ignorance is not innocent, but that my ignorance implicates me in the denial. And that in order to be in relationship with my Jewish peers, I had to be able to answer what everyone has done. And at this point, I can tell you exactly where everybody was. I have everybody's SS files. I actually have SS, on both sides of my family. I have, Aryan blood all the way till, as far back as they can do this. And I can tell you exactly where everybody was. And I needed to be able to do this to look my Jewish peers in the eyes. But it meant I had to betray my family. I had to betray the family secret. Right? I had to.
What happened when you revealed that?
So when I had the indictments,
what is your family doing now?
When I had the indictments, there were two things. When I began to read what he had done, I didn't want to know, and I thought, I don't want to know this. Why do I have to know this? This is too terrible. I can't bear it. Right? But I continued reading. I just had to do this in stages. And it's also been interesting because I keep forgetting. It's very hard to actually keep the knowledge of exactly what he did with me, right? So there's a psychological way to somehow soften what has happened, right? So it's very hard to actually keep the truth out. But when I had the indictments, I sent the indictments to my father. And I said, because he kept lying to me, and that became even more embarrassing. So I sent him the indictments. I said, I need you to know that I know, but we don't have to talk about it. So I left him that escape. And so when he called, he said, I got your letter, and I threw it away. So he knew that I knew, and then, we didn't talk about it. And, when I went to Pinsk, I left my children at my father's house. I go to Belarus, that's the last standing Stalinist country. It's very hard to get in. It's unbelievable to travel there. I spent one of the most heart-wrenching weeks in Belarus. I came back to collect my children. My father did not ask what I was doing in Belarus. So that's the silence, right? I mean, that's how you sort of dance around these silences.
You dance around the silences of your father. Because when I see your face, you don't look like you're suffering from the not talking with your father. Or
well, I mean, you have to... I guess I've become more... tolerant is the wrong word, but I appreciate how hard it is. My father was very close to this man, who's dead. Luckily, by the time I knew, he was dead. And so I think I'm able to bear the knowledge because I'm one more step removed. I think the harder it gets, and I've come to appreciate the power of that knowledge. And by the way, when it comes to the perpetrators, and we had some conversation with some people, this is, I mean, to truly come to recognition is almost kills people. I mean, Stangl, right, in these interviews, he died as soon as he acknowledged the severity of this. I mean, this is unbearable. And so this is tough.
Okay, I would like to open the floor to other questions, please. Could you please say who you are? And
yeah, I'm Gerrit van Dijk. That's a Dutch name. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm a reporter from the newspaper, but not only. I am a participant, and I hear very impressing what you told to me. But I was thinking, when I understand you well and hear you well, you do have a plea for what is, let me say, the old-fashioned theology of reconciliation, namely reconciliation through appropriation. I suppose you are very familiar with the Heidelberg Catechism, as German, maybe teached. And also that is the method of the Heidelberg Catechism. Not talking immediately about forgiveness. And sometimes this catechism is very strong, criticized by that, saying, oh, again, but it looks like if the teacher is going, you have to acknowledge what you are, what is your guilt, and also what is the sacrifice, to value the sacrifice. And when I hear you, it's as if, and you can say if I'm wrong or did hear well, a kind of plea for the wisdom of, let me say, this old systematic, even from the Middle Ages, Anselmus, you know very well. Is that right when I hear you?
Yeah, I've become ever more conservative. I'm now thinking about penance. I think penance is a beautiful system. But I think of penance in the sense of bodybuilding, soul building, right? I mean, we build our bodies. We have this strength training for the body, but what kind of training do we have for the soul? Especially after it has been compromised. Broken, right? It's unhealthy, and so, what kind of? So then, then we end up with therapy, and we end up with, with post-traumatic stress syndrome and anxiety disorder and depression, and but really, old-fashioned forms of penance, disciplines to to strengthen the will and the soul, and I think it. Because this is so hard, I think, what do we offer? Why don't we have anything, any kind of system to actually help people to recover?
That's also the idea, justice as a repayment. You made something, if you commit a crime, you made something defect. And now also by under your punishment, it's a kind of a repayment, what you made defect. Right. And we have in Dutch, probably also in German, I don't know, if the fishermen, they repair the nets, in Dutch the term is boeten, and that's boese, I think, in German. And that's also that idea from the nets, what is defect, the holes, it is repaired. It is not the old stuff, but it is a reparation. And I hear all this kind, but I'm a bit amazed. I'm very profound thinking, sure. I'm very impressed with you. But I'm amazed that, I see you, let me say, as a modern theologian, and I hear, recognize, let me say, the old-fashioned theology of reconciliation, and then reconciliation through appropriation.
And the thing is that, yes, I'm coming at this as a theologian, but as a matter of fact, there are hundreds of people from political science, philosophy, law, all of whom are working on issues of post-conflict, transitional justice, peace solution. This is a very, very, it's a global topic right now. And just since I've been here, I've talked to Indonesians, I've talked to Serbians, I've talked to South Africans, and they're all working on the same issue. So the question is, as a religious studies scholar or a theologian, it's interesting that voice has been both sort of moved out, right? I mean, religion has sort of moved into the private realm, but the public secular world is now reinventing the wheel, so to speak, and coming up with sort of new means and topics to actually do what religion used to do. But I think there's a lot to learn, and so I'm part of that dialogue, to try to actually...
Thank you. Some other questions. Alex, yeah.
About the Mark of Cain. This mark is a sign not of conviction, but of protection. Cain bears a great guilt. At the same time, he is portrayed in the book of Genesis as the founder of a city, more in fact, the founder of civilization, human civilization. But what he gets a son with the name Enoch, and he names the city not after himself, but after his son. That's a way to put himself to make himself forget that people of next generations don't remember him as the founder of the city, he who bears a guilt, but his innocent son. And that's a paradox, that people bear guilt, and at the same time they produce good things. We know that many former Nazis were very successful in post-war Germany in creating the Wirtschaftswunder. And that's also this double size of, and also former Nazis, for example, Werner von Braun, was at the heart of the space project in the United States. And people with this guilt were used by the United States to act as spies and so on. So whether you are the loser, whether you were an adherent to a bad ideology or to a better ideology, but what is better and what is worse, it's always this duality of our existence which produces good things and at the same time bad things. Can we ever solve this problem? Is there a process of reconciliation also between civilizations and ideologies to wipe away this dualism themselves?
Well, I resist making this completely universal, Because I think there was lots of discourse where, Germans like to talk about sort of universal sins and we're all sinners. And that was sort of another way not to talk about the very particular one. And, we may all be sinners and we may all be perpetrators, but only some of us are in fact mass murderers. And I think that's actually an important distinction to have. And clearly, killings may be with us. I don't see the world, in fact, breaking out in paradise where we don't kill each other anymore. But I do think that not all guilt is of equal weight. And I think these distinctions are important, to be very, very precise in how we talk about this and not to cover it in a universal solidarity of guilt. So the German churches spoke of the solidarity of guilt. All Germans bear, if not all of humanity bear, a solidarity of guilt. And I don't want any part of this. I don't live in this solidarity. I want to know, I want to own mine, and you should keep yours, right? And then we meet on the basis of that guilt. So the interesting thing about the Mark of Cain is, what would the world look like if we bore our guilt openly, each one of us? That would be an interesting world, right? Because I think we always live in this illusion that the guilty are somewhere over there. And most of how we deal with crimes and guilt is that we expel people or we imprison them. And so we sort of purify our world by somehow keeping the bad elements out. And that's, of course, behind not letting the Islamic State fighters back in. Of course, they came from here, but then once they're out, we don't want them back. And so in the United States, we deport Nazis, as if Germany wants their Nazis back. Why don't we? We don't purify our communities by somehow keeping the bad out. And I think if we all were open about our guilt, we would quickly come to realization that we are both sinner and saint, right? To put it traditionally. We're all somehow implicated. And I think that at least creates a measure of compassion and humility. I think those are very virtues to have. And for instance, when I give this talk about my uncle in America, I always make sure to say that I give myself about a 1% to 5% chance not to have become a Nazi. Because everyone in my family became a Nazi, and I think the Nazis would have taken everything I pride myself about, my passion, my curiosity, my ambition. All of those would have been prime hooks for National Socialism at the time. And the 1% to 5% I give myself are entirely about having a relationship with a Jew or a communist, somebody who didn't fit. But I think it's very important to keep in mind that I am who I am now because I grew up in a very different world, and I was given opportunities to grow and to be in a plurality of people and to have exchanges and to have sort of an education, all of which members of my family did not. And I don't judge in the sense of you're terrible people and I'm better because I now see what was wrong, right? I think humility is an important part. We don't see our own, as it says, we see the flaws in other people much clearer. It's so obvious while seeing our own flaws are just, it's much more complicated.
There is, for one more question, we have time. Okay.
My name is Mercedes Sandbergen. I'm the director of the Kitty Kotti Dialogue Table. The Kitty Kotti Dialogue Table, we commemorate the abolition of slavery. And my question to you is about these rituals. You were talking about these rituals. Rituals of repudiation. And you, for example, you mentioned public apologies. And our government is not willing to make any public apologies. Am I irritating you? No. Oh, sorry. I thought you were. And I was wondering if you could come up with some suggestions. How we can start a movement within the Dutch society whereby public apologies are being brought forward, even though perpetrators any longer within our society. We discussed this a couple of times, but is this something you think can be activated somehow?
Heat, oxygen, microbes. You need heat. It's something that is dormant because nobody is talking about it and there's no anything. Nothing happens. So it actually there needs to be some kind of external or internal pressure, but it takes some heat. It takes oxygen, which means it takes knowledge. It takes information. You have to know. I mean, just as I had to go to the archives and I had to dig it out, you have to go to the archives. You have to dig out the information. And microbes, lots of kitty kotti tables, lots of conversations, lots of,
And you think that will then eventually lead to public apologies?
There will be enough pressure to do so. In America, where that is also, not done, even though American slavery is a virulent, toxic super dump, right? I mean, this is if ever there is a toxic history that continues to be virulent, but public apologies. Never mind reparations. Never mind anything. So, but as you all know, there are lots of demonstrations right now, and I think there's going to be another round. And I do believe that until and unless these steps will be done, this continues to be a toxic history. I mean, the amazing thing is that 100 years are nothing. 200 years can go by. You look at Turkey and Armenia. That history is toxic. You look at the Balkan, that history is toxic. And so that there is some real urgency, in fact, to stabilize these histories into something that both sides can own as a common history, as victims and perpetrators, come together and remember this as something that does not divide, but that actually unifies. These histories will remain dangerous.
The Dutch government is anxious for financial consequences. It claims they are afraid for claims. As they should be. Yeah. No, I know, but
and so that's why I call it.
Let me confess, I include myself, are terrible merchants.
Right, but and that's why I call it rituals, because I think they're always symbolic. And when you look at Germany, as painful as it is, the reparations payments are actually going up, and you begin to accept them as sort of a tax on peace, right? On a good conscience, and are actually willing. It's good for business to pay reparations. It's good for business, and especially when you do it up front, it is not a negative drain. I mean, in the beginning, it feels like a sacrifice that will impact you negatively, but it's in fact an investment that pays off in the future.
So that will be not the end of this discussion on how to deal with our garbage, I think. So, but thank you so much, and all of you are invited, I think, just to have a of what you want together and just to talk a little bit more about this very interesting and moving lecture. So thank you very much, Katharina, to share your experiences with us and your research. And thank you for coming.
Garbage is good.